U.S. President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs kick in, threatening to disrupt the global economic order as we know it. The target? About 86 countries, including the Philippines, with exports to the U.S. levies ranging from 11% to a whopping 104%. And across world financial markets, it looks like more miserable days are ahead.
China is bearing the most brunt, with duties nearly doubled on import goods at 104%. Beijing says it will stand up to Washington's, quote, blackmail and bullying, and promises to retaliate. Now, amid prodding from world leaders and even allies in America, Trump is not standing down.
He has since given mixed signals on whether his tariffs will remain in the long term, saying on numerous occasions that he is open to negotiations. For now and for Trump, this is one bitter pill that the world just has to swallow.
I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something. I spoke to a lot of leaders, European, Asian, from all over the world. They're dying to make a deal, but I said, we're not going to have deficits with your country.
Back here in the Philippines, government has relatively downplayed the impact of Trump's tariffs. Let's get the insights of Dan Lachica, president of SEIPI, or the Semiconductor and Electronics Industries in the Philippines Foundation Incorporated. Good evening to you, Dan, and welcome to The Big Story. What is the assessment of the industry, the semiconductor and electronics industry?
Well, good evening, ladies, and thanks for having me. Actually, if you look at it, and I'm talking about the reciprocal tariffs, right? The Philippines is actually in a very good position. We're at 17%, and compared to China at 34%, which you said the net effect is 104%. But compared to our ASEAN neighbors, our big competitors, we're still very low. And so the even better news is that for the semiconductor industry, we're way below the radar, as we don't really have any big tariffs to worry about for today anyway. And hopefully this doesn't change much in the near future.
So, Dan, you share the assessment of the government that this isn't going to affect us so much, although we don't exist in a vacuum. You know, it will be affected by what's happening around the globe.
Actually, we're in a much better place. I was speaking with a couple of companies who were looking at the Philippines as an option. Both of them were in China, and they're looking to move some of their products out of China. And of course, the Philippines is a worthwhile destination. And this was even before the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs. And so even today, that has been confirmed. And, for example, you look at Taiwan at 32%, China at 34% for the reciprocal tariffs. Even Japan is at 24%. And these are all based on the trade deficits. And as you know, with the Philippines, with a net deficit of 8%, that's really the main reason, one of the main reasons why we're at the low of 17%.
So the U.S. is our second largest market, correct? Compared to next to Hong Kong. So
Yes.
do we look for other markets for our goods, semiconductors and electronics in particular?
Clearly, and not just the market for exports, but also for a source of raw materials. China still seems to be our biggest source of materials. And definitely, well, if you look at it, I guess one question would be, what should be our posture with the United States concerning these tariffs? There are three options. One is to retaliate, just like China is doing. The other is to do nothing, which is always an option. And the second would be to continue discussions, negotiations to, for example, establish an FTA, free trade agreement with the United States, or inclusion, re-inclusion in the GSP. And as of this point, the best option probably would be to do nothing, because we're enjoying the lower tariffs, the lower reciprocal tariffs. And in fact, it's a wait and see game. Let's see what the United States does, because on one hand, Trump might change his mind. But again, as of now, it's better not to do anything and just ride on the wave of the lower tariffs, but at the sidelines, continue discussions and negotiations with establishing a free trade agreement and or re-inclusion in the GSP.
Dan, if I'm not mistaken, you've been advocating for that policy, a free trade agreement or a TAA with the United States. This must be like, if off the top of my head, since 2018. Has there been no progress considering that conductors and chips make up like 60% of total Philippine exports?
Yes, not as yet. And I know Secretary Chris Roque and the DTI folks have been working on it. With the change in administration, I know the former President Biden was open for discussion, but right now President Trump might be distracted with a lot of other things. So the discussion just has to continue. The implication of not having an FTA is, when we have companies that deal with the federal government, they won't be allowed to export, their products because they're not TAA compliant. And so we're losing millions of dollars every year because of that. So companies would be looking for countries with TAA agreements with the United States. So we want to plug that gap, that hole, and that's why we want to pursue the FTA.
Okay, well, now might be the best time to pursue that, or at least you have some leverage on the DTI. But Dan, you previously predicted flat growth for your sector this year, 2025, even a decline of 10%. Have you readjusted your projections for 2025, given this the Liberation Day tariffs have already come to play?
We had our biggest year in 2022 at $49.5 billion. Since then, we've contracted by 8% in 2023 and another 6% in 2024. And so, looking forward in 2025, we were projecting a flat growth. But then, with these developments, as well as the Create More Act, we're hopefully going to be at least at modest or flat growth, if not positive. I was just in South Korea with the Create More Roadshow headed by Secretary Go, and the response was really favorable. And like I said, we've got inquiries on the new business climate in the Philippines, the ease of doing business, the improved incentives taken in by the Create More Act. And so we're looking forward. I don't want to jinx it, but I'm even looking for maybe a modest growth on top of the flat growth that we projected for 2025.
And then when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing, I mean, for years, we weren't really able to put up all these front-end wafer fabrication facilities because of high power costs. But now, is there a way to offer low secure energy and security at a low cost to all these investors, considering we now have lower tariffs compared to our ASEAN neighbors?
That's a good question. There have been a couple of other developments that have come about. The first one, well, like I said, the passing of the Create More Act. And then in addition to that, our president has declared the Semiconductor and Electronics Industry priority industry. And on the tails of that, there was an administrative order number 31 from the Office of the President creating a Semiconductor and Electronics Advisory Council, which would help facilitate the investments and remove the roadblocks. And you're correct, we still have high power costs, high labor and logistics costs. But again, the government is actively pursuing remedial measures for that. I mean, clearly, for power, the priority of the Department of Energy, Secretary Lotilla, really is to ensure that there's adequate demand so we don't have brownouts or shortages, especially during the summer months. But then again, we've looked at that, and with the government, working with the government, looking at possible options, near-term options. And one of them is to, for example, have an embedded power supply in an industrial zone. That's why you can reduce the power by taking away the distribution cost, the transmission cost, and even the VAT in an eco-zone. And so that hopefully will be a model for reducing the power cost. And as far as the logistics cost, there's the Luzon Economic Corridor that basically links the Subic port with the Clark Airport with the industrial zones along the way, all the way to Batangas, and that's why one of the there's an eco zone in that area that's being touted as the model of what can be done nationally in terms of lower power costs, lower logistics costs, and of course, continuing efforts to improve the ease of doing business will also help.
And speaking of the ease of doing business, I mean, how crucial is it that our government's policies are somewhat stable and predictable? Because I believe that was a concern of investors before.
Well, that has been a major problem with the previous administration. In fact, we've seen some capital flight because, we have a law and that's changed. And so that basically rocks the stability of the whole infrastructure of the whole government, right? So much so for sovereign guarantees. But again, with the new administration, the efforts that they're doing to restore the confidence of the investors, for improving the FDIs, and hopefully we'll surpass that. It's just a matter of getting the show on the road, literally. That's why we're having this road show led by Secretary Frederick Go and DTI and, even the other cabinet members, so that we can announce to the world that we're back in business, we're open for business, and the Philippines, especially with the tariffs that we've been talking about, is the ideal place for their expansions and new investments.
Going back to that silver lining that you see and even government refers to and other analysts, how immediate can that be implemented? Or you mentioned that there are already 2 interested parties to move their operations to the Philippines?
Yes, there are. Unfortunately, I can't announce their names. They're public companies.
Of course,
but I see this just as at the beginning, especially because, like I said, this came about even with the just speculation of increased tariffs from their respective manufacturing sites. But now with the formal announcement of the increased tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, I would expect to see more, coupled with the road shows that I mentioned is being done by the government through the leadership of Secretary Go. And of course, DTI is involved, PEZA is involved, and we'll hopefully see more of that coming on board.
So this is the reason why you're seeing maybe a growth this year instead of a flat performance for 2025.
Yes, that gives us some ray of hope, some optimism, and like I said, the advisory council, I'm chaired by Secretary Go, and the vice chairman would be DTI with other cabinet members. Hopefully, we'll see that get into gear real soon, coupled with the action items, parallel action items that the government is doing. So I'm hopeful that we'll see at least a modest growth this year. But again, for now, we're remaining with our flat growth projection, but we'll update that to the course of the year.
Dan, I'd like to be candid with you. A lot of people are scratching their heads about this optimism that seems to be coming from the Philippines alone. Yeah. Everybody's so worried about the uncertainty about these levies and its impact on the global economy. And here in the Philippines, we're really optimistic.
Conservatively optimistic is how I describe it, but because it's a very complex economic system, right? It's a global system. I'll give you an example. We might have, for instance, low tariffs for electronic parts, automotive electronic parts specifically. But if the rest of the world, especially countries that export steel or export automotive the vehicles, then, with the high tariffs, the demand could possibly be much, much lower than they projected. And what does that mean? It will affect the supply chain. It will affect the automotive electronics parts that are coming out of the Philippines. So even if we have the benefit of the low tariffs, if the global demand for such product lessens, then obviously that's going to have effect on the supply of automotive electronics parts. So it's just an example of how complicated this supply chain works and the impact of countries with having different kinds of levels of tariffs.
Yeah, but that's exactly the point, right? I
You
mean,
don't see that affecting the performance this year of our semicon and electronics industry.
Well, like you said, we just don't rely on the United States. As you mentioned earlier, we need to diversify the export destinations. We need to ensure that we identify the product lines that are not as susceptible to this global challenges and work on that. But that's why I was saying earlier, we're being conservative with flat growth, although there's really a silver lining, so to speak, like you said, and there's upside on how we can grow this 2025.
okay, but Dan, a lot of economists are actually really worried because the last time we saw this level of trade war, quote unquote, was right after the Great Depression, right around the Great Depression, and that, of course, precipitated World War II. Although we don't want to fearmonger, but we're wondering, like, are there any mitigating, like, things that on to? We understand that we got low tariffs, but again, if the entire world economy suffers, eventuality, have there been meetings with the members of SEIPI, and what are their top line concerns right now?
Well, I've spoken with our members, and obviously we've talked to our government partners. In situations like this, it always pays to look at the different angles, look at the worst case situations and alternatives and options to have mitigating plans. But like I said, we just need to diversify the market. Externally, we have to diversify our market. And internally, we just need to improve our cost of doing business, the ease of doing business, and our efficiency, production efficiency in our manufacturing lines. So we have to look at all fronts and not be complacent just because we have lower tariffs.
What other markets for our semicon exports are you guys eyeing as an industry group?
Well, there's Europe, for instance. The top markets, as you mentioned earlier, United States, even China is still a big market. And what we can see as opportunities for improvement would be in Europe because, for instance, Germany is only importing about 6% of our products. Netherlands about 5%, and some European countries haven't even heard of the capabilities of the Philippines, just like France, for example. Last year, I was with the presidential delegation to the Czech Republic, and we signed an MOU with their Electronics Association. They haven't even heard of the Philippines. So we see that as potential opportunities to develop our export market in addition to the existing ones in Asia and the United States.
All right, thank you so much for talking to us. Dan Lachica, President of the Semiconductor and Electronics Industries in the Philippines Foundation Incorporated.